simply falling asleep. You're stepping into the first gallery of a great exhibition of the human soul. Close your eyes and allow yourself to drift into a sleep where lines, shapes, and symbols speak in the language of humanity's oldest memory. Chapter 4. The Reign of Beauty, Greece and the Greek World. 4th century BCE, 1st century CE. The period during which art moved toward greater freedom spans roughly a century, approximately from 520 to 420 BCE. By the end of the 5th century, artists, and soon after them the public, had become fully aware of the potential offered by these newly discovered methods. Although painters and sculptors were still little distinguished from craftsmen, and had not yet greatly increased their social prestige in the eyes of the aristocratic elite, the number of people who appreciated artworks for their artistic qualities, rather than simply for their religious or civic function, was steadily growing. Viewers began to compare the merits of different artistic schools, meaning distinctive manners or styles associated with specific cities. Undoubtedly, these discussions and rivalries between schools encouraged artists to improve themselves and contributed to the rich diversity that continues to fascinate us in Greek art. In architecture, different styles, or orders, began to be used simultaneously. The Parthenon was constructed in the Doric order, but in later structures on the Acropolis we find the Ionic style as well. The basic layout remained the same as in Doric temples, but the forms and expressive language of the buildings changed. This is especially clear in the temple known as the Erechtheion. The more slender columns of the Ionic order resemble elongated plant stems, and the capitals that crown them are no longer simple cushions. They are richly adorned with volutes, whose elastic curves still serve a structural function, bearing the weight of the beams above. These buildings, with their finely wrought details, convey an overall impression of elegance and lightness. The same qualities are found in sculpture and painting from the period following the activity of Phidias. At that time, Athens was engaged in a brutal war with Sparta, a conflict that ultimately brought an end to the prosperity of both Athens and Greece as a whole. In 408 BCE, during a brief truce, a balustrade was added to the small temple of the wingless Victory, Nike Apteros, on the Acropolis. The reliefs that adorned it exhibit the same refinement found in Ionic architecture. Though many of the figures are damaged, one in particular is worth mentioning because even in its headless, armless state, beauty still radiates from it. The figure is that of a young girl, the goddess Nike, who has paused to adjust her sandal. With what disarming naturalness this sudden gesture is captured. How softly and luxuriously the fine fabric clings to the contours of her graceful body. Works like these show that artists now felt free to do whatever they wished. The struggle to represent movement and perspective had been overcome. But this new mastery carried with it the danger of self-indulgence. The artist who worked on the Parthenon frieze seemed not to flaunt his skill. He understood his task and strove to fulfill it as best he could. He likely did not think of himself as a great master whose name would be spoken of thousands of years later. By contrast, in the frieze of the Nike Apteros temple, we begin to sense a shift, an author celebrating his own creative freedom. Thus, over the course of the 4th century BCE, the artist's relationship to art began to change. Phidias's statues were renowned throughout Greece as incarnations of divine presence. But by the 4th century, temple sculptures were more often valued for their artistic merit. Educated Greeks now spoke of painting and sculpture in much the same way they discussed poetry or theater, praising the beauty of one work and criticizing the design or concept of another. The greatest artist of this period, Praxiteles, became famous for his enchanting figures, known for their soft tonal quality and elusive moods. His most celebrated and widely praised creation was a youthful Aphrodite, the goddess of love, stepping into a basin for a bath. Another statue discovered in the 19th century in Olympia is thought by some to be an original work by his hand. Though certainty is elusive, it may simply be a fine marble copy of a lost bronze. The figure represents the god Hermes, holding the infant Dionysus and playing with him. If we turn back to the previous chapter, we can see just how far Greek art had progressed in 200 years. In Praxiteles' work, all traces of earlier rigidity are gone. The relaxed posture of the figure even suggests a touch of irreverence toward the dignity of the gods. Yet, if we look closely, we can see that the lessons of the past have not been forgotten. Every part of the body, every joint, is still rendered with clarity and anatomical understanding. But this does not result in lifeless stiffness. Now the sculptor can show the subtle play of muscles rolling beneath delicate skin, achieving the impression of a living body in all its grace and beauty. Still, we must recognize that Praxiteles, like other Greek artists, arrived at beauty only through long preparation and experience. In life, such perfect, symmetrical, well-formed bodies as those seen in Greek sculpture do not exist. There is a common assumption that artists of the past, observing numerous living models, would simply eliminate any features they found unappealing, that they began by carefully copying the external appearance of a real person, and then perfected it, removing any traits that didn't conform to their ideal of beauty. When it is said that Greek artists idealized nature, what is often implied is something akin to the work of a photo retoucher smoothing out minor flaws. But just like an overly retouched portrait, an idealized statue conceived in this way would lack both character and expressive power. So much would be erased, so much simplified, that all that remains is a vague, blurred shadow of the model. The Greek approach, however, was quite the opposite. Over the course of centuries, artists gradually breathed the vitality of life into ancient formal frameworks. By the time of Praxiteles, this method had borne its most mature fruits. In the hands of skilled sculptors, earlier abstract schemes came alive, began to move, and appeared before us as living human beings, yet beings from another, better world. Indeed, these figures seem to belong to a loftier realm, not because the Greeks were inherently healthier or more beautiful than other peoples, there is no reason to assume this, but because their art had reached a level of development where the typical and the individual existed in a subtle and harmonious balance. Many of the works from this classical period, later hailed as perfect expressions of human beauty, are in fact only copies or variations of statues created in the mid-4th century BCE. The Apollo Belvedere, for example, is often regarded as the epitome of masculine beauty. The god stands before us in a striking pose, his arm extended in a sweeping motion as he holds a bow, his head turned slightly, as if following the flight of an arrow. It's not difficult to discern here the original canon, a method of distributing the parts of the body into their most characteristic positions. The Venus de Milo, named for the island of Melos, where she was found, is the most famous of all antique Venuses. She likely belonged to a sculptural group depicting Venus and Cupid, created somewhat later, though under the clear influence of Praxiteles. The composition is meant to be viewed from the side. Venus originally stretched out her arms toward Cupid, and again we are struck by the clarity with which the sculptor rendered the beauty of form. The skill in emphasizing the essential volumes without lapsing into stiffness or vagueness. Of course, this method, gradually filling a schematic framework with the breathing substance of life, had its limitations. It produced convincing human types. But what about individual personalities? Strangely enough, the Greeks did not know portraiture in the modern sense until the end of the 4th century BCE. And while some portrait-like intentions may have existed earlier, it is likely that such statues bore little actual resemblance to their models. A statue meant to depict a military commander, for instance, would generally show a dignified warrior in armor and helmet. The artist would not have tried to replicate the specific shape of his nose or brows, nor capture his facial expression. We have not yet paused on this interesting feature of Greek art. The faces of statues almost never depict distinctive facial expression. This fact can be surprising, for even when drawing a simple cartoon face, we instinctively give it some expression, usually cheerful. The faces in Greek sculpture are neither lifeless nor dull, but they never express strong emotion. What Socrates referred to as efforts of the soul were conveyed by artists through gesture and posture. But they were wary of disturbing the harmony of the face with emotion. The generation of artists after Praxiteles began searching for ways to enliven the face without sacrificing its beauty. By the end of the 4th century, they had succeeded. More than that, they had learned to portray emotional states and individual physiognomies, in other words, to create true portraits. In the time of Alexander the Great, this new art of portraiture became a topic of cultural discussion. One writer of the period, mocking sycophants and flatterers, noted their custom of loudly praising their patrons' portraits for their astonishing likeness. Alexander himself preferred portraits by his court sculptor Lysippos, who was famous in his time for his masterful fidelity to nature. A freestanding version of one of his portraits of Alexander, c. 66, shows just how much the art of sculpture had evolved, not only since the charioteer of Delphi, but even since the comparatively recent work of Praxiteles. Naturally, when evaluating ancient portraits, we cannot be certain of how closely they resembled their subjects, certainly not with the confidence of the flatterers mentioned above. It's entirely possible that a photographic image of Alexander would have looked nothing like his marble bust, and one might reasonably suspect that Lysippos's statues resembled gods more than they did the actual conqueror of Asia. But one thing is beyond doubt. In that face, with its slightly raised brows and subtly shifting expression, we can read Alexander's character, his restless spirit, extraordinary gifts, and the sense of entitlement bred by constant success. The empire Alexander created played a pivotal role in the history of Greek art. The visual language that had once belonged to a handful of small city-states now spread across half the known world. The art of this later period is usually not referred to as Greek in the strict sense, but rather as Hellenistic, a term derived from the name of the kingdoms established in the East by Alexander's successors. The new capitals, Alexandria in Egypt, Antioch in Syria, Pergamon in Asia Minor, posed different challenges to artists than those they had faced in Greece. Even in architecture, the simplicity of the Doric order and the light elegance of the Ionic no longer satisfied patrons. A preference emerged for a new form, the Corinthian column, named after the wealthy trading city of Corinth. This new order, which appeared in the early 4th century BCE, added decorative acanthus leaves to the Ionic volute, giving buildings a more sumptuous appearance. In the Hellenistic cities of the East, large-scale, imposing, and lavishly adorned structures were built. Few have survived, but those that have still impress with their grandeur and opulence. The stylistic features and artistic discoveries of classical Greek art were now being applied to the Eastern tradition of monumental scale and display. As we've already seen, Greek art as a whole underwent significant changes during the Hellenistic period. The nature of these transformations is vividly revealed in the great sculptural complexes of the time, such as the Pergamon altar, constructed around 160 BCE. Its frieze depicts the battle between the gods and the giants. A magnificent work, but one in which the classical harmony of earlier Greek sculpture is nowhere to be found. The artist was clearly drawn to powerful dramatic effect. In a frenzy of motion, the gods overwhelm the giants, who fall and rise again in frenzied agony. The entire composition, filled with swirling draperies, gives the impression of tempestuous movement. This impression is enhanced by the high relief. The figures no longer submit to the plane of the wall, but project almost as fully formed sculptures, churning out toward the viewer, spilling onto the steps of the altar. Hellenistic artists delighted in such dynamic scenes. They wanted to impress, and they knew how to do it. It was during this period that works were created which would later be hailed as classical masterpieces. When the Laocoön group was unearthed in 1506, artists and art lovers alike were struck by its tragic intensity. The scene comes from Virgil's Aeneid. Laocoön, a Trojan priest, had tried to warn his fellow citizens against accepting the wooden horse, a supposed gift that in fact concealed Greek soldiers. The gods, seeing their plans to destroy Troy endangered, sent 2 massive sea serpents who, winding themselves around the priest and his 2 sons, strangled them to death. Ancient mythology offers many such examples of the Olympian gods' senseless cruelty toward mere mortals. It's not hard to imagine how such a story could captivate the artist's imagination. But what precisely was he aiming for? To instill horror at the suffering of an innocent victim punished for speaking the truth? Or to showcase his skill in depicting a frightening, borderline sensational spectacle? A man's desperate struggle against monstrous forces. Whatever his goal, he succeeded. The muscular tension of the torso and arms, contorted in anguish, the priest's agonized expression, the twisted forms of the doomed children. All of it is woven into a compact and cohesive composition, where tumultuous countercurrents are masterfully condensed into a single sculptural unity. And for centuries, this work has justly commanded admiration. Yet at times, I can't help but wonder whether such art wasn't intended for an audience that found its thrills in the bloody spectacles of the gladiatorial arena. Still, perhaps we shouldn't judge the artist too harshly. By the Hellenistic period, art had already lost its former sacred connections to magic and religion. Artists devoted themselves entirely to the refinement of their craft. And it was precisely these dramatic scenes of struggle, filled with outward motion and emotional tension, that offered the best opportunity to demonstrate artistic sophistication. The question of whether Laocoön's punishment was just probably didn't much concern the sculptors who created the statue. In this atmosphere, wealthy individuals began to collect works of art, paying vast sums for rare originals and commissioning copies of inaccessible masterpieces. Interest in art spread among writers as well. Biographies of artists began to appear, anecdotal stories were compiled, and travel guides were written for visitors. In antiquity, painters were held in even higher esteem than sculptors, but we know of them only through fragments preserved in ancient texts. From these, we gather that painters too were more preoccupied with the technical challenges of their craft than with questions of religious service or spiritual purpose. We read of artists depicting scenes from everyday life, moments unfolding in barbershops or on stage, but none of these works have survived. Our only window into ancient painting comes from the decorative frescoes and mosaics uncovered in Pompeii and a few other locations. Pompeii, a bustling provincial city, was buried under volcanic ash during the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE. Almost every house and villa had walls covered in paintings, receding vistas framed by columns, stage-set imitations, or trompe-l'oeil paintings in painted frames. Not all of these works can be called masterpieces. And yet it's hard not to be astonished by the sheer number of high-quality paintings in a relatively modest, second-tier city. It's unlikely that archaeologists of the future will discover anything comparable in one of our modern seaside resorts. The interior decorators of Pompeii, as well as those in neighboring Herculaneum and Stabiae, evidently produced free interpretations of the works of great Hellenistic painters. Amid the sea of artisan imitations, we occasionally catch sight of a figure of enchanting grace, like the girl dancing and plucking a flower shown in illustration 70. She is Hora, the goddess of fleeting time. Or we notice a detail such as the head of a faun, revealing the freedom artists had gained in expressing emotion. In these decorative murals, we find nearly every genre of painting. Depictions of animals, charming still lifes, like a pair of lemons next to a glass of water, and even landscapes. Landscape painting, in fact, was one of the most important innovations of Hellenistic art. The ancient East had no tradition of landscape, aside from brief insertions in battle scenes or depictions of daily life. Classical Greek art in the time of Phidias and Praxiteles was focused almost exclusively on the human figure. But during the Hellenistic period, when poets like Theocritus began to celebrate the idyllic pleasures of pastoral life, artists too responded to the tastes of urban patrons weary of city life by creating images of the countryside. These were not depictions of real places or identifiable views of nature. They were more like carefully composed collections of motifs forming an idealized idyll. Shepherds with flocks, garden estates, and distant mountain ridges. These selected, visually pleasing elements were arranged into harmonious compositions. The overall impression is one of serenity. But even these works are not as realistic as they might seem at first glance. If one tried to draw a map of the landscape shown, one would quickly realize that the task is impossible, and there are no answers to clarify the spatial relations. We cannot say how far the villa is from the sanctuary, or where the bridge lies in relation to either. The reason is simple. Hellenistic painters were unfamiliar with the geometry of linear perspective. While we may groan at the thought of drawing endless lines of poplars converging on a single vanishing point, as we did in school, such concepts were entirely unknown to ancient artists. They represented distant objects as smaller and closer, or more important ones as larger. But they did not yet understand the consistent optical reduction of size according to a fixed viewpoint. It would take more than 1,000 years for this principle to enter artistic practice. And so, even in the most accomplished and confident works of late antiquity, we still find, at least in residual form, some of the principles we saw in Egyptian painting. Even here, the characteristic outline of an object carries as much weight as what the eye perceives in a particular moment. As we've observed time and again, this is not a flaw deserving blame or regret. It is the only way to achieve perfection within a given stylistic system. The Greeks had broken free from the rigid prohibitions of ancient Eastern art and set out on a path of discovery, gradually enriching traditional schemata with observed reality. But their artworks were never intended as mirrors, passively reflecting every detail of nature. They always bear the imprint of the mind that created them. You can close your eyes now. Picture the marble temples of Athens, rising white against the sky. Picture the Kouros, still and eternal, stepping into light. Hear the echo of chisel against stone, carving gods in human form. The myths are old, but they breathe still, in symmetry, in silence, in the measured beauty of a single column. Sleep now, under the gaze of Apollo, where man stands between beast and god, where nothing is random and every curve means something. Your dreams will follow the rhythm of flutes and geometry, and the stars will look down as they did when the first statue opened its eyes.